Hello and welcome to Accessible Globe TV. Today we are talking about a very serious subject, and that is dementia. It's a growing problem in Australia and throughout the world, and in fact this week on Australian News I heard this startling announcement.
Dementia has taken over heart disease as the biggest health issue for older Australians. Experts say the finding reinforces the need for patients and their loved ones to receive the best support and care.
I never believed that it would take the primary place of premature death for Australians and to overtake heart disease. I'm just very surprised. But because of that, I've decided to rerun a program from a few years ago. I had the pleasure and the honour of interviewing a gentleman called Michael Verdi from Memory Bridge, and he looked at dementia, Alzheimer's, in a very different way. And he said that we didn't really just need to treat the disease, but more how the disease affected its victims. He called it the dis-ease of Alzheimer's. And he made me look at Alzheimer's and dementias in a completely different way. So with that rather startling announcement this week, I decided that it might be prudent to have a listen to that interview from a few years ago with Michael Verdi. I hope it's helpful and I hope you enjoy it. So without any further ado, let's say good day to Michael.
Good morning, Rod. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. It's actually nighttime here. It's 11 p.m. where I am.
All right. Okay. Well, I keep that in mind.
I'm a night person, so that's all good. Michael, you're heading to Australia and Hervey Bay for this masterclass, and there's a lot of people that are really excited about it. Could you tell us a little bit about Memory Bridge?
Sure, Rod. Memory Bridge exists to end the emotional isolation of people with dementia. Often when people hear the word dementia or Alzheimer's, they immediately think of the brain and neurons and those kinds of things, which is all, I suppose, apropos if you're trying to find a cure for a disease. But the experience of living with dementia it's not reducible to neurons. People with dementia have feelings, they have desires, they have kinds of human needs that relate to the body and relate to relationships with other people. And so in Memory Bridge, we make a distinction between Alzheimer's disease and the dis-ease of Alzheimer's. And the dis-ease of Alzheimer's primarily is emotional isolation. And Memory Bridge exists to end that isolation because there's no necessary reason why someone with dementia need to feel lonely or depressed or anxious. Those kinds of feelings are not inevitable. And a lot of the times, those kinds of feelings relate to a person's relationships with other people. And when people begin to pull back or disappear from someone's life because they have dementia or some kind of disability, that is what is called an illness in distinction from a neurological disease. The illness has something to do with the quality of a person's relationships and the way people interact with them. So Memory Bridge exists to do something about what we can do, and that relates to keeping people meaningfully connected to other people.
So Michael, from what I've found out in a few days, you're not trying to cure Alzheimer's or dementia. You're trying to enrich the experience and learn to live a rich lifestyle with it. Would that be a good way of looking at it?
Right, it would be, Rod, as long as we keep in mind that it is the relationships in a person's life that is decisive about whether or not they have well-being or ill-being. So a real quick example, let's say I have a neighbor named William and it's Monday. Monday evening at a social gathering, someone tells me that William has dementia. Now, William is still my neighbor on Tuesday, except now it's my neighbor William with dementia. Something in my mind has recategorized William into a new kind of person almost. And consequently, when I see William on Tuesday, there's a high probability that the way I communicate with him is going to be different. And that difference is going to involve me pulling back or beginning to become self-conscious about interacting with William. In other words, William is going to feel a difference in our relationship. If you multiply that by however many number of relationships are in William's life, that's a big impact on his well-being.
Well, we'll get back to Harvey Bay and what you're going to do in a minute, but some of the things you brought up there, you say that, to put it, you make a statement that people with dementia are people just like us, and we tend to, do you think we tend to forget that? And if we are forgetting that, what are the steps we can take to avoid doing exactly what you've just described?
The number one thing to do is to risk relationship, risk conversation. I don't think this is something, let's make it clear what we're talking about. When someone hears that someone has been diagnosed with dementia, some peculiar thing happens in their imagination. They recategorize that person from what was previously a neighbor to now a person or patient with dementia. In other words, there's a change in the way we frame that other person, their identity. That change, that reframing, the only way to undo that really is to risk getting to know William and staying in a meaningful relationship and discovering, hey, look, there's not as much different about William as I imagined there was. In other words, you don't solve this, Rod, through PowerPoints and through learning formulas. You get over these kinds of fears by actually risking relationship and learning that there's nothing to be afraid of.
And sometimes you might even find more from that William because he's dropped some of his social norms. You might even learn more than what you did in the beginning before. You say that, well, first of all, I think from what I've been hearing, one of the key things is to lose your fear of feeling foolish or all that sort of thing. Drop all the social norms and just learn to be the people that we really should be and be prepared to be vulnerable. Would that be correct?
That's pretty close how I would say it, Rod. Consider for just a second, we are terrified of being socially awkward. Starting from first grade, we learned, do not be the weird kid. Do not be the strange kid, because we saw what happened to the kids that were labeled strange. They were ostracized or bullied. So we get good at passing for normal. And therefore, we start to get terrified if we're not passing for normal. And that feeling, that fear of social awkwardness explains why millions of people are unnecessarily dying of loneliness. So I would agree with you, Rod. If we can get over our fear of being socially awkward or not passing for normal, our ability to stay in intimate relationships with people with dementia will be 100%.
For me, you can't see probably, or you can if you look closely, but I'm in a wheelchair. I was born with cerebral palsy. So I was the weird kid at school quite often. So I learned what it was like to be that person. And in a way, it's made me more able to be myself in some ways, I think. Another thing that you say is not to put people in categories. And I've been struggling with that since I heard you say it, because these days I feel like people use categories to demand entitlements. I'm a part of this group, therefore you have to give me this, you have to do this for me. And I think in doing that, we're making it worse because we're kind of glorifying categories. I don't know if you know what I'm trying to say.
Right. I think I have a sense of what you're saying. First of all, when any two people meet, within 1/20th of a second, we make what's called an appraisal of each other. And the fundamental appraisal that we make of the other person is that they're either an us, which means part of me, part of my family, part of my group, or they are a them. And depending on what category we give them, instantly there's physiological consequences. So real quickly, I'm taking a time out for just a second, Rod, to stress how big a deal these categories are. And I'm saying the fundamental category is us or them. And if we appraise the other person as a them, our amygdala releases a hormone that encourages our body to feel either disgust or fear. If we appraise the other person as an us, the amygdala also releases a hormone, but this is oxytocin, and that encourages us to get closer. It promotes feelings of affinity. So that fundamental distinction, us or them, has a profound consequence on us before we're even conscious of it. So I would say no matter what categories were used, whatever, how nuanced, and they get quite complicated in this day in age, at the root of those various categories is one or two judgments, us or them. And our lives depend on each other, seeing each other as us's.
The thing is, if we just hang out with the people we see as us, we're going to have a fairly boring life. It might be safe, but it's going to be fairly boring.
Well, wonderful point. Think about that, Rod. If we are the folks who build and grow us, we could make the us as diverse as there is diversity. In other words, the us could have unlimited degree of diversity. So there's no reason, and you make a good point. Our us could be very homogenous and, like you say, very uninteresting ultimately, or our us can be very heterogeneous and infinitely interesting.
I think we have a choice often of being safe and staying on the ground, or taking risks and flying high. That's the way I see it.
Rod, I think that's a beautiful way to put that. I mean, just imagine if we had a choice about coming out of the womb, probably most of us would have chosen not to come out because it must have been a terrifying instant when we hit the light. And if we just use that as an analogy, I think we have choices all through our life. Am I going to stay in this womb? Am I going to stay in this cave of the familiar? Or, like you say, am I going to risk the light and take flight?
Yep. Well, I have a whole theory on that. In fact, if I'll come to your talk, you can come to mine on the weekend, and I'll expand on that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to it, Ron.
Let's get back a little bit to Harvey Bay. What is it that you want to achieve by coming in and talking?
I want to dissolve the cliches in the field of dementia, and perhaps it's true in disability more generally. There is a survey of cliches that people take for granted. And these frames of reference end up getting in the way of relationships. In other words, we have concepts and we don't risk getting out of those concepts to meet particular people. So what I wanted to do is dissolve frames of reference that are causing people with dementia to be thems in our imagination, so that people can begin to discover aspects of the other person that they haven't noticed because of their frames of reference. There is a world of life waiting to be lived if we, as you say, will take the chance of getting out of our cocoon, our comfort zone that we use to keep ourselves safe. In other words, people with dementia are dying of loneliness because we're not taking a chance to be close to them on new terms.
And I think you'll agree with me that people who come, they might come thinking they can help people with dementia, or they might want to learn what they can do. But really, if they take it to heart, they're going to get just as much or more for themselves out of it. Would you agree?
I would say that's true for any relationship. But real quickly, I also want to stress that at the base of my message is not about what we can do for people with dementia. There's all kinds of things that we can learn about things to do. But my interest is in relationships with people with dementia. And ultimately, that's not a doing verb. That is a being verb. People with dementia need more than us to do things for them. Just like everyone, people with dementia desire for emotionally meaningful relationships. They desire to be friends, neighbors, fathers, sons, daughters. And those things are not just doing verbs. So that's what I want to kind of keep our imagination attuned to. How can we be with each other so that no one feels like a them?
Yep, I understand that. I mean, there's so many things going through my mind at the moment with that. That my mind's just going around and around in circles. Somebody asked me, because I've looked at a little bit of the Memory Bridge stuff, and at the masterclass, you'll be looking at your new documentary, and people will be seeing how Memory Bridge works, and how by taking the risk of being a person with another person, the people were speaking who doctors were saying weren't going to talk again. I think that's a fair way of putting it.
Absolutely. If you think about our capacities and our feelings, if you think about anything related to ourselves, it is never just about my ego inside this skin. Who I am is always a who in relationship. And if you take me out of relationships, my capacities are going to change. My emotions are going to change. In other words, it takes two people for there to even be one person. And often what happens in the lives of people with dementia is the people around them begin to disappear, and they end up isolated in an island of awkward. And when we're alone on an island of awkward, our capacities are diminished, and the way we feel about everything drops to its lowest possible point. We're not designed to live outside of relationships, and there's nothing about dementia that changes that.
In fact, I think that I'm guessing, and I'm kind of comparing this to some disability stuff that and things that I've done. When the dementia kicks in, there's still a lot of instinct, and there's still a lot of spirit that just takes over from the rational thought. I'm guessing, but I don't really know. And Memory Bridge is about that, I think.
There's a spectrum disorder. So any generalization that we would make about people with dementia in general is probably not going to be applicable to a particular person. Can you imagine, for instance, the diversity within the universe of disability? If somebody said, people that are disabled are, and they said anything, they would be wrong about a particular person with a disability because they're talking in generalizations. That's the exact same thing with people with dementia.
Good point. I mean, when I first started doing travel for people with disability, I went into it and thought I knew everything for the first 2 days, and then I realized I knew nothing because there was such an incredible amount of diversity. Can I ask you a couple of kind of corny questions, I guess? When I watched the Memory Bridge,
Rod,
go on.
Excuse me, just 1 second. You mentioned that when you got introduced to the world of disability, that there was a moment when you felt like you didn't know anything. And I want to say that is a wonderful moment that we all need to get to with respect to people with dementia. When we realize that we don't know anything, we're in the perfect place to begin a real adventure. As long as we think we know everything, or even certain things are certain, we will not begin an adventure. We will be living out a script. And there's a big difference between an adventure and a script. So that not knowing anything is a wonderful place to be.
It's a place of discovery, I know that, and it's a place that I like to be in that regard. Just to ask you a couple of corny questions, watching some of the stuff I've watched in the last few days, it brought to mind The Notebook, the movie, which to me was an example of someone... Sorry?
I haven't seen it, so I'll trust your judgment.
Well, it was about someone who was willing to risk just being with one person and being themselves, and in doing so, they came back, even if it was just for 5 minutes. So it kind of reminded me of that. That and the other thing that I saw, which was a documentary on Glenn Campbell called I'll Be Me, where they took him touring, and that was amazing also.
Yes, well, let me say about that, one thing to be mindful of, we don't want, I'm speaking for myself, to get into the trap of looking for Disney moments. In other words, if we imagine getting close to someone is going to lead to a magic moment that is somehow all of a sudden somebody starts to speak again or stand up and walk and that kind of thing, we're living out another script. Often the intimacy enables very subtle but life-changing changes. So I definitely want to say that there can be dramatic differences when someone feels love, when they feel they belong and matter. but we probably want to avoid the idea that if I speak to my neighbor nicely, all of a sudden their memory is going to come back or something like that. And I know you're not saying that, but it's very easy because of those depictions to get into a kind of another script that, while it might be flattering at one level, is dehumanizing in another level.
Absolutely. I understand that. I apologize if I was giving the wrong thing,
No,
because the other thing that worried me, and I wanted to ask you, when you take that risk and you get down very close and personal to someone who's probably living, or possibly living, a life which is quite frustrating for them at times, is there a danger that they can become frustrated and violent? And if that's the case, how do we sort of deal with that? Or is that not something that happens?
Well, let me answer this way, Rod. I connected young people for 5 years, about 4,500 young people with dementia over a 5-year period. And that meant going to visit an elderly care home 5 times over a 10-week period for every one class of these students. In any case, after 5 years, we had no incident of violence or someone acting out in any way that was harmful to the students. So yes, people can get frustrated and act out, but that's true for everybody. That's true for you and me. That's not as much of a, it's not a stage that people go through called the violent stage.
Okay. It was a question that was asked to me, and I really didn't have an answer. So thank you for that. It's reassuring to have that answer. I've got a couple of questions about correlations between physical disability and mental health and dementia, but I'll get into them in a minute. Michael, I grew up, well, it's a better way of putting this. You mentioned when you talk about people with dementia that there's a great need to be loved and probably a fear of being alone and loneliness. Now, when I was born 3 months premature. And for many months, I was in a humicrib. So I had very little human contact. And for most of my childhood, I had nightmares where I would come out of school or I would come out of anywhere and everyone was gone. The whole world was gone. There was nobody. I was just alone. Now, I'm wondering, and I'm drawing a long bow, I understand, that sometimes I'm wondering if that some of the needs and instincts and requirements that happen in dementia are similar to the needs and requirements that we have when we're forming our very formative times, like I had.
You know what? That is a profound insight, Rod. And in fact, Naomi Feil, who is the creator of validation therapy, believes that at the end of life, that folks with dementia are inclined to manifest the behaviors of whatever life stage that they cease to grow in. So, for example, this is based on Erik Erikson's life stages. And the first life stage is to establish trust. And if you establish trust, you get to move to the next life stage, which is independence and so forth. And if you don't get established trust, you never really establish independence. So at the end of life for all of us, and we feel vulnerable, it's very likely that we do return to the life stage where we were last sort of in our element. And I think what you just said is 100% potentially true for all of us and not just people with dementia or disability.
The second time I noticed a similarity, I guess, was when I became a house father for 6, what we called then, I don't know what the right words are, were intellectually handicapped children. And I had a house with, and I was the house father, and there were 2 autistic children in it, 2 Down syndrome, and 2 what we call then brain damage, okay? Interestingly enough, when I went into that home, I was told that the young boy with autism would scream and yell and have problems, and I was to just put him in his bedroom, shut the door, and wait. The first night that it happened, I went in and put George Benson on the stereo, and he was very calm and very quiet within 20 minutes or less. And again, I feel like it's an instinctual need for comfort that is quite similar. I was very privileged that he spoke to me 2 words, and he hadn't spoken since he was 2. 2 words over 2 years, mind you, but they were precious words for me, even though one was just telling me to be quiet so he could go to sleep. But that beside the point. So I'm wondering, as I learn about Memory Bridge and things, I just wonder how much the similarities might be there, and something that would be interesting to explore in some ways.
Absolutely. And what a wonderful example you just gave. First of all, this young man with autism was partly suffering because his carers did not imagine that he had the same human needs that we do to feel emotionally connected to other people. In other words, his situation was autism was one thing, and that was neurological. But he also had another situation, and that had to do with the understandings of the people around him. And by you having an instinct that this young man was as human as any person, and that he may enjoy stimulation and your affection, you broke out of what was probably considered standard practice at the moment. Well, guess what? We've got standard practices right now that in their own way are equally backwards. And we have to break out of those. And that's as true for people with any kind of situation, including all of us. You know, if you say a person with dementia, what about a person with depression? What about a person with debt? What about a person with a criminal background? What about a person who's insecure? You know, we're all people with something. And if we will get to the root of our humanity, we will be able to understand that without each other, we're not people with anything at all.
You're right. And for me, because I know you also talk on religion, I struggle with religion, but my religion, in my opinion, needs to be more humanity. If humanity becomes the religion, then the world becomes a better place. But that's just my feelings on things. But I will tell you.
That sounds very odd.
Sorry?
That sounds very good to me, brother.
I'll get one quick one just for you. I have to tell the story. The same kid with the autism used to love ABBA. You know, I mean, you can't have everything, but he loved ABBA. And one day I heard Mamma Mia being hummed, and it sounded pretty amazing. And I went into the bathroom, and there was Peter standing on his head on the toilet seat with his head in the basin to get an echo. And of course, stupidly, instead of being quiet, I went, Peter, and then he fell in the toilet. But anyway, it's another story. But he was a great kid, and I miss him and I love him very much. Michael, there are so many things I would love to talk to you about. Just human nature. There's all sorts of things that I want to talk to you about. Like, I have a theory that jealousy is just a fear of being alone. I don't care if my partner loves another person. I'm just scared that I'll end up without my partner. So it's another story. There's so many things I want to talk to you about.
I think that's profound, Rod. And guess I would say the same thing about dying. I don't know that we're afraid of physical death. I'm guessing we're terrified of a sociological death. And that sociological death, I think you depicted it beautifully by opening a door and everyone being gone. And I think jealousy is a wonderful way of also being an analogy to that fear. So many things probably go back to that fear. In fact, that might be the primal fear.
'Tis for me. I know that. So
I think that's true for me.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I'll have a chat to you after this, but before, just right now, I just want to thank you for the time. I want to say that we're really looking forward to you coming to little old Hervey Bay. It's a wonderful place. And we're looking forward to learning and seeing the documentary. And, mate, we'll see you in Australia.
Rod, thank you for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to meeting you and learning with you as well.
Thanks, mate. That was Michael Verdi, and what an incredible pleasure it was to talk to him and then later on at the workshop to learn from him. And boy, did I learn a lot of things. If you would like to know more about Memory Bridge, or even when the next masterclass might be on here in Australia, leave a comment in under below or send us an email, and we'll keep you informed as to when that might be. He really is an amazing man to listen to. Well, that's been our program today. I want to thank everybody for listening who's got through to the end. I know it was a bit long, but I think there was loads and loads of information in there. If you want to know more and if you want to keep up with things behind the scenes and all sorts of other things, please join our new Patreon channel. That will be a lot of fun to have you on aboard that as well. Thanks again. We'll be back in a couple of days with another program. Until then, let's say thank you to the people who've been looking after us.
If you've enjoyed our content, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like and share the segments. It really does help. Special thanks to Simple Solutions. They're a wonderful NDIS training organisation and also an NDIS provider. Thank you to Hello World Travel in Hervey Bay, who do all the bookings for our various travel adventures. Totally Mobile, who are there for all your mobility needs. Also, a big thanks to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's provided by the government, but without it, I would have loads of trouble actually living life and making these programs. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you again real soon.